The idea that a man is obliged to pay on a first date just because he is the man is shocking. Maybe I've been doing feminism too long. I thought we were all working towards a society where there aren't expectations prescribed by gender. Surely women are contradicting themselves as we list our demands. What do we want? Equality, respect, lasagna, green beans and small potatoes.
Sara Pascoe, hello.
Hello.
Thanks for joining us. You were reading from your new book, Sex, Power, Money, and that extract about lasagna, green beans and small potatoes comes from a chapter entitled The Economics of Dating. So when it comes to paying the bill in a restaurant, where do you stand?
Well, I was very naive about this because and this sounds terrible, have never dated. I've always just kind of fallen into relationships, usually because I know people already or you've kind of met them after a couple of drinks, so I'd never actually gone through this. So I didn't know that was still happening until there was a reality show, still is, on British TV called First Dates with a wonderful Frenchman called Fred who kind of hosts the whole thing, and he's very charming and romantic. And this show really fetishizes this idea at the end of the meal in heterosexual couples, a man kind of says, no, let me. And I kind of thought, no, that's not still a thing, is it? Like in the olden days, like in fairy tales. And apparently it is for lots of people. And so I found it really fascinating.
Illuminating. Now, you're best known in the UK as a comedian and performer doing stand-up to huge audiences in shows like W1A. You are funny for a living, but this book is actually very serious, quite scientific in its approach. Why was sex and the resulting power dynamics such a compelling subject for you?
Well, it kind of became more compelling. It kind of grew out. So with this book, I didn't kind of do a proper pitch of like, here's what I'm going to attack and here's the areas I'm going to research. I thought I was just going to take a little skim across and have a little bit of a look at kind of pornography and transactional sex in a book that was going to be about the male body and male physiology. And the minute I started researching, I realised my own ignorance, which in one way is fantastic because you then go, oh, okay, at least I know I need to know these things. But in the other way, it means, and now I have a lot of work to do to try and understand something better. And I realised that discussions about pornography or transactional sex that weren't dealing with biology were a little bit neck up, kind of a bit moralistic or theoretical rather than being interested in why and where these things might come from. And the other side was to look at anything that involves money and sex without looking at power dynamics, because quite often it's the inequality of power that causes, obviously, it's so intermingled with the inequality of economy as well. And those things seemed like really kind of important factors aside from the sex.
As well as putting it together.
Yeah.
Now, as you mentioned, you deal with pornography in this book, and you say that you came at it from a slightly biased point of view. You felt protective towards these women.
Yeah.
And you do say, to quote you, I cannot feel the same way as I would about hairdressing or bus driving.
Oh, yes.
And after everything you've read
Yes.
and researched, what's your opinion now?
Well, I think what I've realised a lot now is that personal morality, sometimes our personal feelings can get in the way of objectivity. So, for instance, I don't want to sell sex, and so when I imagine scenarios that would compel me to or force me to, I kind of want to protect any other person from that situation. But what I've realised from interviewing people is that in terms of wanting to help people, you might have very good intentions. You have to listen to what they want. And so in Britain, that's to decriminalise sex work, which seems like a very odd thing if you think, well, but they're so vulnerable and there are these very bad people who attack them and hurt them, but they actually become more vulnerable by criminalising what's happening. So it's actually the exact opposite of what I thought right at the beginning, which is you just tell men they can't buy women's bodies and this whole situation will be improved. And actually it's the opposite. So the law in the UK means that people can't work together. So two people can't kind of hire a room or a house. That's called brothel keeping, which means that quite often the thing that would make them safest, which is having someone else downstairs or knowing where they were or having also seen the customer's face, that's technically illegal. And there's things like that I was completely ignorant about. And now I feel like you have to always listen to the people who it affects rather than people speaking on their behalves, even if it's very well-meaning.
Mm-hmm. Now, something you also bring up is the internet, which basically changed everything in terms of pornography. How do you feel that it's having an effect on young people's sexuality?
It's very interesting. The idea of them watching hardcore pornography before they've had any sexual experience themselves, I think all of us find this very troubling. What became clear to me as I was researching is that we all kind of, again, emotionally believe something, but there hasn't been that much study or proof. There are some theories and case studies where people think that it's really helping sexual exploration. Because everything is available, people who've got kinks or certain sexual persuasions don't feel alone. They're not the only person they know that has these kind of leanings. There's communities around, so that's really positive. But the other side of it is that there are young people who are getting a huge amount of sexual information only from pornography. And so as a society, the way that we do sex education has to change.
Now, language, you point out in this book, is very important in the debate. As you point out, for example, the shift from the word prostitute to sex worker.
Yeah.
And in places like Germany, where there are some legal brothels, or Holbeck in Leeds in the UK, where there's a kind of legalised red light zone, do you think that that kind of situation is the progressive solution?
It's interesting because lots of people don't like the legalisation aspect, they like the decriminalisation. And again, something for me that I didn't realise they were separate things. And with Holbeck, which seems to be very complicated, what they've legalised is the touting for business. They still have to leave to go and actually have the sex. And again, for lots of people who live in that area, which they call it the managed area, it doesn't seem to be a kind of idyllic utopia where suddenly this really great things happen, and people have still been murdered selling sex in that area, so it hasn't made it like safer.
Okay, so it's not quite there yet. Gender politics, of course, and the issue of consent is something that we've been talking about a lot recently, and what people name this Me Too era. You actually bring up the Weinstein scandal in your book as well. And as well as the criminal nature of charges of sexual assault and of rape, there is this toxic element, like you say, of power and how that power comes into that mix, and it sometimes can create a culture of silence. How do we change that?
It's very difficult with a hierarchy. So, like, it's not just my profession or the performing arts where these things happen. Everyone who has ever worked in a job has had an experience, and I'm not saying that these are experiences where you'd want to go to the police, but just a kind of experience where your boss does something or says something, and you know that if you talk back or say, excuse me, that was very rude, or this is your employer. And with lots of people, so what happens with comedy is that if you're self-employed, you're reliant on lots of people wanting to work with you. And if you complain about one person, they just don't have to employ you again. Being disbelieved, being seen to be a troublemaker, it's very difficult to assert yourself. I guess communally we have to be much better at supporting each other. Your job, your source of income is your safety. It's quite often much easier to go, okay, eyes down, concentrate on the job, that kind of thing.
Yeah. As I mentioned, you delved into a lot of scientific research, a lot of evolutionary biology for this book, and to a certain extent for your previous book, Animal. And I did get the idea reading it of just how much that scientific data fascinated you, the findings and handling all of that. Do you think you might be a scientist trapped in a performer's body?
Oh, do you think so? I think the lucky thing, the opt-out I've got is that whenever I get very confused by the information or go, but this isn't proven, or this is such a small study, I can remember, oh, you're a comedian. You're not supposed to have all of the answers. Like, one of the things about kind of putting information that I found there for a reader, I'm really careful to keep stating, this is opinion. I'm not qualified. I'm a regular person trying to find this out and trying to grapple with it as a way of kind of widening out the conversation, not to go, oh, by the way, I've got all of the answers, here they are, because I absolutely don't have them, which I think for a scientist, you have to concentrate and go, but what can I prove? Yeah.
That's their job, yeah. Now, in all of that research, some of it involves animals. Which species would you say you were really impressed by that we as humans should be taking tips from?
Oh, well, so what's very interesting, people always come back to bonobos and chimpanzees. So bonobos are little chimpanzees, aren't they? And so our closest relatives genetically, chimpanzees and bonobos. Chimpanzees they multi-partner but are very aggressive. Hey! and so they fight a lot. They fight a lot over mates, and they are very hierarchical, and they suppress and they dominate. And bonobos, they just all have sex all the time. And it's for us, we would consider it too much, because they kiss on the mouth, and but they do that incestuously as well. And the females in particular, when it ever looks like a situation is going to become aggressive, she just gets off with everyone. She's like, calm down, calm down. And so they multi-partner in a way to kind of avoid warring and fighting. And so I always think that's very interesting. That I'm not saying we should all kiss each other all of the time, but in terms of like love and bonding instead of aggression, or sort of way of kind of. So there might be something about bonobos that we can learn from. But I think we've kind of got both in us.
As a stand-up comedian, you're one of the few visible women in comedy in the UK, a growing number. And a fellow woman in comedy, Jo Brand, got in a lot of trouble recently when she suggested someone throw battery acid at Nigel Farage instead of the now traditional milkshake.
Yes.
What did you think about that whole thing? Do you think people are losing their sense of humour, or do we have to be more careful with words?
I actually think quite often this is one of the topics that gets a lot of clicks. So I actually think quite often it's blown out of proportion by people writing about it, because everyone you meet just goes, she's a comedian making a joke. More often what people will say is, I didn't think it was a funny joke. They'll say that, go, I didn't laugh, and because she didn't kind of gear it towards Nigel Farage. She said that milkshakes weren't far enough, just battery acid. It was so clearly and technically a joke by a comedian on a comedy programme. I don't think anyone was upset.
Okay, well, speaking of UK politicians, technically they're the ones with the power at the moment, but you who explores power dynamics,
Yes.
how do you see everything that's going on in Westminster right now?
Well, it's really interesting because so we've got a Prime Minister now called Boris Johnson, and he has followed a Prime Minister called Theresa May, who threw a Brexit decision that wasn't hers. So she wasn't Prime Minister when we voted for Brexit. That guy left. He went, uh-oh, go. And then so you've got Theresa May, and because the situation was so complicated, she was made to look very weak. Now, and I'm not saying this was a gendered thing. She was made to look very weak because she couldn't get the support of her government. So the next person coming in, Boris Johnson, there he is. He has to do the opposite. He has to look incredibly strong, which is almost like a bulldozer. He has to go straight through, listen to no one. The people have voted for something, they're going to get it, we'll deal with the chaos afterwards. But I think people believe that, if you're strong enough, you can make it happen. But what is it? Like, it's such an indefinable thing. The difficulty of voting for something when it hasn't been defined and then wanting it anyway. I mean, it's Kafka, isn't it? Kind of going round in circles. Yeah. Everyone thinking they know what's going to the effects will be. Yeah.
Yeah, it's quite chaotic, I must admit. Now, we asked you for your cultural tip of the moment, and you pointed us in the direction of a film called Animals.
Yes.
Why should we see it?
I think it's very funny. It's very, very well acted and beautiful. I'm nearly 40, so I don't go out a lot anymore. I stay home and I do my work. And so they drink a lot of white wine in it, and you forget how terrible drinking lots and lots of wine makes you feel. And I read the book, so it's a novel first by Emma Jane Unsworth, and it's just really beautiful in terms of female friendship, and I think in a way kind of feminism and the decisions that we make and whether they're prescribed or actually whether we want to get married and we want to have have families and things like that, but dealt with in a really, I think, acerbic and modern way.
Okay, well, we'll have to check that one out. Thank you very much for the tip, Sarah, and thanks so much for coming in
having me.
Today. We'll leave you with a clip of Animals, directed by Sophie Hyde. Do remember you can get more arts and culture on our website. Stay with us here on France 24, where the news is coming up in just a moment.
What do you use for bitters?
Ground up paracetamol.
Nice! What do you say your name was again?
Chicken sandwich.
That's a beautiful name.
We are going deep tonight.
You're my team! They're going to build a statue of us, immortalised in marble. This is the bit where I puke.
The golden years.